This week on BSD Now, we have assembly language on OpenBSD, using Beehive for FreeBSD development work, also gaming on FreeBSD and FreeBSD for Thanksgiving, and no space left on Dragonfly BSD's Hammer 2 file system, and other interesting news items in this week's episode of BSD Now. BSD Now, episode 274, Language Assembly, recorded on the 28th of November 2018. Hello, I'm your host, Benedikt Reuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And welcome back to a great episode of BSD Now. I hope we have something interesting for you because we have a broad range of topics today. And starting off with headlines is assembly language on OpenBSD AMD 64 and ARM64. This is over at cryogenics.net, and this is a short introduction to assembly language programming on OpenBSD. So in case you haven't looked at that for a while, this is a good introduction. Because of security features in the kernel, the author here have had to rethink a series of tutorials covering AArch64 assembly language on OpenBSD, and therefore this will serve as a placeholder reminder-y thingy. Okay, so OpenBSD, like many Unix and Unix-like operating systems, now uses the executable and linkable format, aka ELF, for its binary or library binaries and executables. Although the structure of this format is beyond the scope of this short introduction, it is necessary for them to explain part of the from the headers. And within the program header, there are sections known as pt_note that OpenBSD and other systems use to distinguish their ELF binaries or executables. OpenBSD looks for this section to check if it should attempt to execute the program or not. So our first program,
if you've ever tried to use the Linux emulation stuff on FreeBSD, you might have encountered the program brandelf, which lets you change this information at the beginning of an executable, and particularly, mark this as this should run as Linux. And then when you try to run the binary, the FreeBSD kernel sees that and says, "Oh, this isn't a FreeBSD binary; it's a Linux binary. Let me run it this way." And I think in FreeBSD there's also support for running some really old, like original BSD binaries and so on. And again, using that type of thing.
So they start off with the first program that is written in C. Interesting enough. And it's often a good idea to prototype your assembly programs in a high-level language such as C, which can then double up as both a set of nodes and a working program that you can debug and compile into assembly language to compare with your own ASM code. So there's the C program. It's very simple. You just do the syscall and then return. And then you run clang with -o to create the name of the executable, and of course then you provide the name of your C program or the location, and the same with GNU C, just different compiler, and then you run the program. Well, of course it should do nothing, just silently exit and return to the shell prompt. Exciting, yay! Next we will rewrite this program in assembly language, and so that's what they do here. And here's some general purpose registers that you might need in this case. So the accumulator, the base, the counter, the data segment can extend into the accumulator, the source index for string ops, as well as the stack pointer, which is an important thing because that points where you are currently at in your program, in your stack, and the base pointer, as well as the general purpose registers where you can put data into and grab it out of there. These are your basic variables. And so the system calls, such as the one we're using here in this C program here, sys_exit, they are defined in sys/syscall.h, the header, and assemblers, unlike C compilers, can't use these C/C++ include files, so we need to extract defines and macros from them to implement in assembly. So that said, some fancy assemblers such as FASM and NASM may provide macros for common types and functions, but we're good purists, so won't mention those. And so it goes on a little bit into the section node.openbsd/indent or ident, and there's your assembly program. So you link that, of course, because just compiling doesn't get you much, and you need to link that with AS, and then use LD, the actual linker, and provide the parameter -- dynamic -linker, and link that to ld.so.
Or you can statically link it.
Sure. And that way you have your little program, sysexit, and you can also see the return code with your on the shell, $? Gives you the return code from the previous program, and that tells you whether the program ran successfully or not. If it's returning 0, then it's returning fine, or just ran fine. And if there's a different code other than 0, then there's usually something wrong or some error happened. And the article continues with some inline assembly. I guess it's best people look at that themselves if they're interested. So it's a good introduction into basic assembly programming and getting started. And all on that on OpenBSD. But I guess the instructions are not too specific, except for the OpenBSD sections.
Yeah, but in general, it shows loading the value 123 into the RDI register, and then the RAX register, and then calling syscall. It shows 2 different ways to do it. But you see, when you compile it, you get the same result.
Yeah, that's it.
And then they repeat the same thing for ARM, where the assembly language looks a bit different.
Yep. So the article has all the code in it. If you just want to try it out for yourself, then it's all prepared nicely, and you should be on your way into assembly programming. All right. Next up, we have using Beehive for FreeBSD development.
Yeah, so this is by John Baldwin, who has since actually done quite a bit of work on Beehive, in addition to being one of the biggest contributors to FreeBSD.
Oh, yeah.
It starts out with a note saying that the original version of this article was published in the July-August 2014 edition of the FreeBSD Journal. Of course, some details have changed since that time. It's been a couple of years. And for example, Beehive now supports running on AMD processors and so on. However, I still use the network setup that he described in that article today because it works great. However, several people have asked for examples of NATed VMs and so on a laptop, so he's added that as well. So one of the exciting new features of FreeBSD is Beehive, the hypervisor. Basically allows you to run virtual machines in a wide variety of applications on FreeBSD. So this article will focus on using Beehive as a tool for aiding development of FreeBSD itself by running the experimental FreeBSD that you're working on in a hypervisor. If you manage to panic the kernel, it doesn't take out the machine you're writing the code on, just, the subprocess where you were running that code. So it has a little background on what the hypervisor is. It's not that new anymore, so maybe we'll skip over a little bit of that. Importantly, though, he describes the network setup he uses. So the network connections between the guest and the host can be configured in several different ways. 2 different setups are described below, but there are many possible configurations. So the only guest network driver currently supported by Beehive is the VirtIO network adapter. I think actually in 13 or 12 and 13, there's an emulated Intel available now as well. But
oh, cool.
You'd only want to use that in the case of an OS that doesn't have VirtIO support. Anyway, each network interface exposed to the guest is associated with a tap interface on the host. The tap driver allows a user program to inject packets into the network stack and accept packets from a process. So by design, each tap interface will only pass traffic if it is opened by a user process and it is administratively enabled or up. As a result, each tap interface must be explicitly enabled each time a guest is booted. This can be a bit inconvenient, especially if you're constantly rebooting the guest because it's crashing, or you're just, all right, now I want to try a new kernel, and then another new kernel, and so on. So the tap driver has a setting called up on open, which you can set via a sysctl, which will cause the equivalent of doing ifconfig tap3 up every time Beehive opens the tap interface. So with that, you'll have basic networking between the guest and the host. So you basically give the host an IP on the tap interface and have the guest have an IP inside the VM, and they'll be able to talk to each other. But you might actually want the VM to talk to your entire network, not just your laptop or the machine you're running the Beehive on. So you can use bridged networking. So one simple network setup bridges the guest network of the VM directly onto the network which the host is connected. So a single if bridge interface is created. The tap interface of the guest is added to the bridge along with one of the physical interfaces of the host. So in this example, they create a bridge, add the RE0 network adapter from their laptop or desktop, and then add the tap and set the bridge up. And now the guest will be able to reach any host on your physical network. And then here, this example shows how to configure that up with rc.conf so it happens automatically at boot. Another popular choice, especially since it's not really possible to bridge to Wi-Fi, is to use NAT. And this will basically have some internal network addressing between the host and the guest, and have the host then translate that out into something that will go out to the regular network. So this setup also uses a bridge, but only the tap interface is used by the guests added to the bridge. The main point of this is to let the guests talk to each other directly without having to go through the NAT and so on. So the bridge members are all assigned addresses in some private subnet. The bridge interface is assigned an address from that private network for the host side. And the host will basically act as a router and permit the guests to reach out to the internet or whatever. And you can obviously configure the NAT to allow the internet to reach into the guests if you need as well. So in this example, they will set up the bridge kind of the same as before, although they set up auto bridge so that every tap that's created will automatically be added to the bridge. Configure the bridge with an IP address, enable gateway, which makes your machine into a router, enable NAT, and tell it to NAT all the stuff out over your wireless, and enable the IPFW firewall. You can also choose to use something like a DNS mask to set up a DHCP server to have the guests get DHCP and so on.
Yeah, there are various options.
Example of how that. Yep. Also shows how to make it use your host resolver and so on. Then they have an example of using VMRun, which is an example script for starting Beehive that's available on FreeBSD. And then they talk a bit about configuring guests. FreeBSD guests do not require extensive configuration settings to be able to run. Most settings can be set during the system installer. However, there are a few conventions and additional settings that can be useful. If you're booting old FreeBSD prior to 9.3 or 10.1, the console isn't necessarily set up the way you would like for Beehive. Generally, you're not going to be running FreeBSD that old anymore, but back when this article came out, that was actually relatively modern. If the guest requires network access, you want to make sure that it does DHCP or something on whichever network. If you're running DNS mask and so on. So your basic config can be give the machine a host name, tell it to use DHCP on the VirtIO network adapter, enable SSH, and disable sendmail. Now, on to actually doing the fun stuff. Using Beehive guest as a target. So one way Beehive can be used while developing FreeBSD is to allow a host to debug a guest as if the guest was some remote machine. Specifically, a test kernel can be built on the host, booted inside the guest, and then debugged from the host using KGDB. Once a guest is created and configured, and a test kernel has been built on the host, the next step is to boot the guest with that test kernel. The traditional method is to install the kernel into the guest file system, either by exporting the build directory to a guest via NFS, or copying the kernel over the network, or mounting the guest file system on the host directly, like with mdconfig, if your guest is run with from an image file or something. However, an alternative method is available via Beehive Load, which is similar to booting the test machine over the network. So if you're using Beehive Load, which is basically a version of the FreeBSD bootloader rewritten for user space, and then with the Beehive bits added on, the Beehive Load program allows a directory on the host file system to be exported to the loader environment. This can be used to load a kernel and modules from a host file system rather than the guest disk image. So the files don't actually end up in the guest, but the loader, so Beehive Load is basically copying the data for the kernel and the modules that you specify from the disk of the host directly into the memory of the guest, and then running them, similar to how the loader boots FreeBSD normally. So the directory on the host file system is passed to Beehive Load with the lowercase h flag. The Beehive Load program exports a host 0 device into the loader environment. And so you just basically configure your machine to boot from host 0 and then /boot/kernel or whatever. So the VMRun script in FreeBSD 10.1 and later allows the directory to set with the capital H environment, or capital H argument. The script will convert a relative path to an absolute path before passing it to the Beehive Load for you. So booting a test kernel from the host inside of the guest involves basically you make install with a dester to some directory somewhere on your machine, and then you give that directory to Beehive Load, and then you reboot the VM and tell it the path I want you to load is host 0 /boot/kernel/kernel. And now the guest will start with that new kernel. Allows you to iterate very quickly because you don't have to try to get the files into the VM every time. You can literally just restart Beehive.
Yeah, and it's quicker and much more convenient to have a quicker cycle between development and seeing what your development looks like.
Exactly. So you just go into your compile directory, you install, or just from the root, you can do make install kernel dester equals, Beehive VM0 host or whatever on your in your home directory. They have this special parameter, kmod own. In this case, it'll even make the files be owned by the John user instead of root. So actually, this part can all be done as a regular user even. And then you can just run the VMRun script and point it to that directory. And then in the loader, you just tell it to load that kernel, which you can configure this via loader.conf inside, so you don't have to do it every time. And then it's pretty easy. Also, you can use the next boot command inside the guest to tell it, next time boot from this kernel. You can give it different names or different directories or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very nice.
As you mentioned, you can configure the debug port, in this case with the -G flag, and then you can connect your KGDB on the host to it, and actually be able to, poke around in the kernel while it's running and see what's up. And it also talks about using the virtual serial port with the debugger.
Yep.
So, the Beehive hypervisor is a nice addition to a FreeBSD developer's toolbox. Guests can be used both to develop new features and to test merges to stable kernels and so on. The hypervisor has a wide variety of uses beyond just developing FreeBSD, obviously, but it definitely has sped up many developers' ability to do things and test things on FreeBSD because you don't have to, build an image or somehow get the new kernel into your existing, VMware or Parallels or whatever VM. You can just say, instead of loading the kernel from the disk image, take it from this directory on my host machine.
Yeah, so thank you, John, for writing that article. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. People can just try it out and start developing this way. So, time for the news roundup this week. And yes, we've done it again. We're covering an article written by Mariusz Zaborski here on his blog. And this time it's about games on FreeBSD. Ooh, I see you getting excited. So he writes, what do all programmers like to do after work? Okay, what do most programmers like to do after work? The answer is simple. Play a good game. Recently at the Polish BSD user group meetup, Moolander was telling us how you can play games on OpenBSD. Today, let's discuss how it looks in the FreeBSD world using the server-only operating system. So the XNA-based games are one of the ways of playing natively is to play indie games which use XNA. So XNA is a framework from Microsoft which uses .NET for creating games. Fortunately, in the BSD world, we have Mono, an open source implementation of Microsoft's .NET framework, which you can use to run games. There is also FNA Framework, which is a re-implementation of the XNA, which allows you to run the games under Linux. So Thomas Vorwein from OpenBSD prepared a script, FNAIFY. So here we are, FNAIFY. That translates all the dependencies used by an FNA game to OpenBSD dependencies. So he decided to port that script to FreeBSD, and the script is using /bin-sh, which in the case of OpenBSD is a Korn shell. And he writes, I didn't test it with many games, but I don't see any reason why it shouldn't work with all the games tested by the OpenBSD guys. So here comes the list. For example, with Cryptarch, Rogue Legacy, Apotheon, Escapegoat, Bastion, Crosscode, Atom Zombie Smasher, and some open source games. Okay, that's already something for a rainy afternoon. And open source games here in FreeBSD and OpenBSD, we also find popular games which were open sourced. For example, I spent a lot of time playing in Quake 3 Arena on my FreeBSD machine. Ah, the memories. Sorry. You can very simply install it using package install ioquake 3, and then you have it. Then you move the files for the skins and maps to the .ioquake directory from your copy of Quake. And in the past, I also played Urban Terror, which is a fully open source shooter based on the Quake 3 Arena engine. Oh dear. Okay, let's never challenge him to a death match. Okay, it's also very easy.
You know, well, I'm pretty good at those too.
Okay, yeah. You bring your both laptops to the next conference. Fight it out.
We just had was it the 100th? No. I don't know. We just had like the 300th LAN party at our college a while back. Oh. 3 months ago? Yeah.
You were there?
Okay. Yes. Because they announced that there would be cake for the anniversary, I showed up. Also because I used to help host them when I worked at the college. And I also attended them a lot when I was a student. And it turns out that they've never missed a scheduled LAN party. But there was one time where Brian, the guy that hosts them, wasn't there because he was too sick. But I hosted it without him and kept it going. And thanks to that, they've never missed one.
Oh.
If I hadn't been around.
Yeah, then the cycle would be broken. Yeah.
Although in the tournament, we had a big match of Unreal Tournament 2004 for prizes. Sadly, I was defeated by my cousin, who's a student there. Oh, sorry. My first cousin, once removed, however it works. My cousin's kid.
It's in the family, yeah.
Yeah. But yes, the prize went to the family, so it was okay.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, so back to the article. The package install IO Urban Terror will get you that game. And in the ports tree in the games directory, you can find over 1,000 directories, many of them with fully implemented games. I didn't test any games.
I haven't even thought of Jazz Jackrabbit since...
Oh, there was always also a Christmas edition with like snow and all that, wasn't it?
I just remember it was a game, a shareware game my mom bought for like $1 out of a bargain bin at a store and brought home one time. And it was basically Epic Mega Games kind of like rip-off of Sonic the Hedgehog.
Yeah. Yeah, with the rabbit as main character.
That was good. Of course, the most important game that he's missing here is OpenTTD, Transport Tycoon Deluxe.
Oh dear.
The best game. And I think the most mature open source re-implementation of a game.
Oh, yeah. With all the train signals.
Originally, it started as literally like a binary patch to the original game. And eventually, they extended it so much it was easier to rewrite the entire game from scratch.
Yeah.
But you still import the original skin, because if it doesn't look the same as it did originally, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't work, yeah.
Although I shudder to think what those graphics look like on my 4K monitor nowadays.
Yeah. Well, but the nostalgia is there. Okay. He didn't test many games in this category, but you can find some interesting titles like OpenXCOM, the open source reimplementation of the original XCOM, where you just go out of your UFO and are immediately shot dead. Frustrating moments in games. So then there's OpenJazz, as Alan mentioned, the Jazz Jackrabbit reimplementation, and Course 6th open source the reimplementation of the Theme Hospital, which was also popular in its day. Quake 2, Open Red Alert, also nice for the strategic gaming. Open RCT 2, which is the Roller Coaster Tycoon 2 reimplementation. So you can see people who like certain games will make sure that they're still available long after their prime time. And there's Open MW, which is the open source engine reimplementation of the game Morrowind. Excellent. All those titles are simply installed through the packages. In that case, I don't think FreeBSD has any difference from OpenBSD. But there's also wine. Not the drinking wine, but the emulator. One of the big advantages of FreeBSD...
It's not an emulator. The E in wine stands for...
Wine's not an emulator. Yeah. It's just to distinguish it from the thing you drink. The big advantage...
I just thought of another game that I should see if has been ported, and if not, it should get ported, which is Free Call, which is a free reimplementation of Colonization.
Yes.
Themed spin-offs of Civilization, but set
Isn't that in Java or something?
No, the original Colonization is...
that was DOS.
That was DOS, but...
and you could also edit some of the files, because they were just text files.
I think this is Java, but maybe it is actually.
Yeah, I remember playing an earlier version, and it crashed because the stack was too full at one point. But yeah, maybe they have a better version now. Okay,
yes. So Free Call is in fact in the ports tree and available to play.
I guess we lose at least a third of the audience by just mentioning these games, but it's definitely news.
Somehow it wasn't quite as much of a time suck as Civilization, but pretty close.
Civilization is the unbeaten
champion
champion on that throne
of time dilation. You play for what seems like an hour, and then you realize it's been 8 hours, and
just one more move, just one more, one more
turn.
Okay, so Wine allows you to run Windows applications under other operating systems, including the Mac. And if you're a FreeBSD 11 user, you can simply fetch Wine from packages by package install. Careful, i386-Wine is the name that you need, and then you have it. To run Windows games, you need to have a 32-bit Wine, because most of the games on Windows are built on 32 bits from back in the day. Maybe this has changed. He doesn't play so much these days. So in his case, because I run FreeBSD Current, I needed to build Wine from ports. It wasn't nice, but it was also, it wasn't unpleasant in that regard. The whole step-by-step building process of a Wine from ports can be found also in the article. And to sum it all up, there's more games and more nostalgia for us. To sum it up, as you can see, there are many titles available for the BSDs, thanks to the FNA and FNA IFY. I'm practicing that. OpenBSD and FreeBSD can work with indie games which use the FNA Framework. There are many interesting games implemented using this framework. Open source is not only for big server machines, and there are many reimplementations of popular games like the Theme Hospital or Roller Coaster Tycoon 2. The biggest market is still enabled through Wine, although it creates a lot of problems to run the games. Also, if you are an OpenBSD user, only this option is not available to you. Please also note that we didn't discuss any other emulators besides Wine. And OpenBSD and FreeBSD, there are many of them for the Game Boys, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the Neo Geo, and other game consoles out there. Oh dear. Yeah, so many fun hours playing. Okay, great. So we just finished that, or at least the US did, the Thanksgiving weekend, but we have an article here from Ben Widowski called FreeBSD for Thanksgiving.
Yes. So Ben writes, 6 months in and still going strong. He says, I've been working on FreeBSD for Intel for about 6 months now. In the world of programmers, I'm considered an old dog, and these 6 months have mostly been about learning new tricks. Luckily, I found myself in a remarkably inclusive and receptive community whose patience seems plentiful. As I get ready to take some time off for the holidays, I move into the retrospective time of year. I thought I'd beat the rush and post a bit of an update. So earlier this year, I decided to move from architect of the Linux graphics driver into the more nebulous role of FreeBSD enabling. I was excited, but also uncertain if I had made the right decision. Earlier this year, I decided some general work in power management was highly important and began working there. I also attended BSD Cam, and he shows the group picture from BSD Cam and points himself up, and led a session on power management. I was honored to be able to lead this kind of effort. Earlier this quarter, I put the first round of my patches up for review, implementing suspend to idle, which is instead of suspend to RAM, it allows the computer to stay slightly more awake but still save a lot of power. I have some rougher patches to handle the S0IX support, so that when you suspend to idle, you can emulate different modes. Anyway, he also gave a talk at MeetBSD about the work of his team. And earlier this month, I noticed that FreeBSD doesn't have an implementation of Intel Speed Shift, the hardware P-States bits. And so he started working on that. And he also links to a Fabricator patch for that. And then he said, earlier this week, I was promoted from a lowly mentee to a full source committer at FreeBSD. And earlier today, I decided to relegate my Linux laptop to the role of backup machine, and I'm writing this from my Dell XPS 13 running FreeBSD 13.
Oh, great.
So he says 6 months later, and I feel a lot less uncertain about making the right decision. In fact, I think both opportunities would be great, and I'm thankful this Thanksgiving that this is my life and career. I have more plans and more things that I want to get done, and I'm looking forward to being thankful again next year.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's good to have Ben on board and helping out with certain tasks or certain areas in the system. And yeah, we're making good progress.
Yep. And thank you from the community to Ben for helping, especially on fronts like power management, where it's often hard to find people that have the right experience and, importantly, sometimes access to the right docs. And you are uniquely suited for that. So yeah, that's a good effort. Although you might not wanted to have admitted that you have so much experience with the Linux graphics stuff from Intel, because we could make you work on that too.
It can come in use. Yeah. Okay.
And actually, the head of the FreeBSD graphics team says that apparently Ben has been lending a hand, so that's good.
Yeah, there's already some collaboration going on. Okay, switching gears here a little bit. We have a story about Hammer 2 from Dragonfly BSD. No space left on device. Sound familiar as an error message?
Yep. So Gary writes in and says, so he has this issue. Hammer 2 does not actually delete a file when you RM or unlink it. Since recovery of a file is possible, that's the point of the design of Hammer 2, there will still be an entry taking up data. It's similar to how Git works. Turns out, I was reading the other day, ZFS does a bit of this for two reasons. One is mostly so that you don't overwrite data in this window where you might roll back. So in particular, if the machine crashes, you might go back to an older Uber block that points to that data before it was deleted. So when you actually delete a file or whatever, it gets it goes on this deferred list and doesn't actually get counted as free space until you've actually gone enough transaction groups that none of the Uber blocks still refer to that block. It's only probably a couple of minutes versus the way Hammer works, but I wonder if that might be more adjustable in the future.
Yep.
So anyway, he looks at the DF and he sees that he has only 75% of his space used, and that means there should be over 4 terabytes or 4 gigabytes in this example available. So the file system could still have filled up. If you're using it as your root file system, then attempting to clean up data might actually fail. If the kernel panics over this, you can see something like this. And it shows an example trying to create an indirect block, and there was no space. And so the kernel panicked in this case. It had written some data, and in trying to write the metadata and stuff for it, they had run out of space. FreeBSD or ZFS does some reservations and so on to make sure that that isn't likely to happen. But he says, interesting here is rebooting will probably not succeed. That could be a problem. So the fix, if you have a recent enough version of the rescue RAM disk installed, on boot up, you can press R for rescue and access the rescue RAM disk. If it's a remote machine, you better hope you have something like IPMI to be able to do it on the remote machine. But then if you mount your Hammer FS system, if you receive an error that Hammer is not found, then your rescue disk is not up to date enough to have Hammer. Anyway, once it's there, you can run the bulk free command to go and clean up some of that freed space that isn't freed yet. If you do not have enough memory on your machine, you may need to mount some swap to be able to do this. Once you've run the bulk free command twice, the usage reported by df-h will be correct. However, there's a chance that on reboot that a core dump will be placed in var crash and will fill up your disk again. And then it notes if you run into this problem and get stuck, they point out the Dragonfly BSD IRC chat room, which you should check out.
Okay. Yep. Good to know. So, time for Beasty Bits this week. Starting off with the BSD Pizza Night in Portland, which is a monthly thing now, or has been for a while.
Has been for a while.
Yeah. So, it's quick and easy at the announcement. Howdy voices of BSD Now. That was written to us, of course. Writing to let you know that several folks interested in BSD are getting together for pizza here in Portland, Oregon, for the last Thursday of the month at 7 p.m. this month on October 29th. November.
29th.
It's November. It is November. We'll be at 48
very longer.
Yeah, right. By the time you listen to this non-live episode, but it's repeating monthly. So
yes, this has been going on for years. So the last Thursday of every month at 7 p.m., they go to a different pizza place. Apparently, they've not repeated. So I'm curious how they managed to do that. Anyway, if you're from Portland, you should check out the site Calagator, Calagator, which is a calendar aggregator. And they always have their meetups posted there. There's also the Portland Linux user group, which is dominated by BSD people. And you should check that out too. But yes, if you're in Portland, and you should hang out with the pizza people, and it's, more informal, just a bunch of people having pizza and talking about BSD.
Well, perfect combination. Okay, yeah, then I guess we'll announce the next one in time so that people can
well, we announced this one last week too, but we just reminding people, hey, turn up.
Yeah.
We have spies at the BSD Pizza Night, and we will know if you showed up or not.
Yeah.
So you better show up, or we're going to be disappointed.
Or a good excuse for that is if you run your own pizza night. And if you do that and it works, then send it to us and we'll announce it on the show as well. Like the next one, the 35C3, the Chaos Communication Congress, is between the years. And here's a little announcement here, which is the place for you, Nix. Got it? Okay. Only one person could read that properly. Yeah. So so this is from the 27th of December 2018 till the 30th of December in Leipzig, Germany, which is a huge, amazing annual congress of the Chaos Computer Club, which is hackers, crackers, and interesting social events in computing at all, and exchange of experience in hacking with and on the BSDs. So there's a sub-event here, or a meeting of like-minded people in this case. And there's links to the ticket pre-sales that have been started already, I think. So be quick about it if you want to attend. And yeah, so there's a bunch of information here, but it's definitely a very interesting conference. It will be streamed, live streamed. They're pretty good at it. And yeah, if you get boring after Christmas, then yeah, that's a good way of getting your hacking vibes going. All right. What's next? Oh, yes. We have Project Trident pre-release images now available. Ooh, that's towards the finish line. So this is over at project-trident.org. And you can see, first of all, what kind of system can this run on? And do I need to buy a new computer for that? And it turns out, well, it runs fairly well on modern PCs. I mean, you need 2 gigabytes of memory. That should be not too difficult. Mm-hmm. And they have an 18.11 pre-release warnings /errata section. So because there are apparently some boot up issues. With the bootloader, yeah. And so if you experience any issues with booting the ISO on the installed system, there's a bug ticket that you can file so that the people can confirm that it's that bug or a different one. And there are some possible solutions for boot up issues. First, you should update your system BIOS following the instructions from your system motherboard manufacturer. And second, if your system has weird corrupted terminal graphics during the boot up, follow a separate guide that's linked here. Or third, try switching your BIOS to legacy mode instead of the UEFI mode. This may have other consequences, though. UEFI is recommended for most modern graphics driver support, so it could work, but it's not guaranteed. So at least try it out and see if it works. They also list a couple of other known issues down there with VirtualBox guest, but they also have a bypass for that. And of course, they list the migration update paths down there, so all the instructions are on the website. And definitely check it out if you still want to report some errors. That's the best way of not finding them in the final release. And that's a good way of getting your see how the system will look like and have a first-hand experience. Okay, while we were on the subject of games, we have Play Stardew Valley on OpenBSD. Oh, this is really the gaming episode today. Yeah, there's a handy little tutorial, just 6 steps, and you're on your way to Stardew Valley. So first, you install the packages, unzip and FNAIF, that was Marius mentioning.
FNAIFI.
FNAIFI. Yeah.
You're converting it to FNA-ish. Yes.
Yeah. And then on GOG, Good Old Games, download the Linux installer, unzip the installer using unzip that you just installed, and then cd into data no arch /game, FNA and IFI, then Stardew Valley, and you start the executable Stardew Valley. Woo! Happy gaming. Great. I'm off. No, I'll finish at least this episode. GUI wrapper for OpenBSD Mixer Cuddle is next.
Yes. So gmixerctl is a GUI wrapper for OpenBSD's mixerctl command line tool, and allows you to control your audio inputs and outputs. It's a Python 3 based, so you can just install Python 3 and run the setup tool, and there it goes.
Great. Yeah, looks nice.
Known issue is that if you configure SND-IOD, or configuring SND-IOD requires the user run gmixerctl so that it can run rcctl as root, and the SDIO tab doesn't auto-update once the application has started. So if you change something over there, you might have to restart the GUI to see the difference.
Oh, yeah. And the last item is a little bit shameless advertising, but it's a good tool. There's QTV, the quick text viewer by our own JT. And so the rationale for that is sometimes I have a directory with hundreds of text files and I need quickly to scan through them to find a certain file. Opening each file to check the contents gets old real quick. Thus the need for a quick text viewer. That's like preview on macOS, hence the name.
Yeah.
So, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do. Don't expect it to do anything else. Well, that's the Unix philosophy. Do one thing, but do it well. And yeah, that looks pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Now, if you made it so it could also write, then it would replace mousepad for me on my Lumina desktop.
Oh yeah, I guess they will have that in Lumina because it just makes sense. Unless they have something else in the file manager already that does that. But yeah, if you're interested in that, check it out. It's QTV on GitHub, and we have the link, of course, in the show notes. So, time for feedback and questions. Yes, we got a little questions from you, the audience, but we need a little bit more to fill the future episodes. So if you have anything, something that you're struggling with, anything that's unclear that we can help you with, or we can also hand it over to the community, then send it over to feedback@bsdnow.tv and we'll have something for future episodes. So first one in this week is Ron with ideas for feedback section, and that one goes like this. It's short, but it's definitely good to have. So he writes, I have a suggestion. Alan mentioned he installed ZFS on his Mac. If so, that might be a good topic to consider as a tutorial. A tutorial of setting up ZFS on a NetBSD machine, maybe?
So it turns out that ZFS is the same on every platform. So you don't really need to install per se. So if it's NetBSD, then if you're running the development version there, or I guess actually if you're running the latest release, it's just built in and you just have the zpool command and use it like you normally would. For OS 10, there's an installer package, or you can go over to the GitHub and follow the instructions. But it's generally, you just compile and install the ZFS package, which gives you the ZFS command and the zpool command, and in the kernel module. So if you check out the OpenZFS on OS 10 Git repo, run autogen and configure, compile it, run the little load script, then you have zpool status, and so on. And then you just do the same zpool create command you would do on FreeBSD on OS 10 or Mac or Linux or Lumos or whatever. The only thing that might be different is what the names of the disks are.
Yeah,
right? It's not going to be ADA0 P3 on Mac OS. But other than that, you end up with exactly the same ZFS.
Yeah, that's all the same commands that you acquire. And I guess for compiling, you'd need Xcode installed, but most people have that already.
But if you're not going to be working on ZFS, there are pre-built installer images on the OpenZFS for OS 10 website.
Even better. And
if you're using NetBSD, same as FreeBSD, it's just built into the OS if you have a new enough version. For Linux, some distros ship with it. Others, if you go to zfsonlinux.org, they'll have RPM packages for CentOS or apt packages for Debian or whatever, and you just install it.
Yeah, straightforward, and make sure to separate your operating system partition or disk from the other disk that you're using ZFS for, because don't wipe out your OS 10 disk, otherwise you won't have much of an open.
What I did was boot into the rescue system on the OS 10, shrink the existing HFS in half, and then use the second half of the disk for ZFS. Yeah,
that's free space then, and then ZFS is happily to manage that. So definitely
and
good idea.
Works great. And I can ZFS send stuff from my FreeBSD machine to my Mac and then take it with me.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Let's hope that helps with answering the question here. And one more thing.
Dave in the chat room points out, don't forget ZFS on Windows.
Oh, yes. It's maturing quickly.
It's a little more complicated, but if you follow the instructions on the wiki, you can get it going, and then you'll have zpool.exe and zfs.exe, and you can... again, the disks names are slightly different, but other than that, you end up with ZFS. It's not very fast compared to elsewhere at the moment, mostly because there's a lot of debugging and stuff left in it so that you can figure out what goes wrong. But in general, you will be able to ZFS send and receive stuff between your Illumos, FreeBSD, NetBSD, Linux, Windows, or Mac machines. Or,
yes,
importantly, import a compatible pool in any of them, making it finally the perfect, reliable, compatible USB stick file system. Once my TV can speak it, it'll be perfect.
Yeah, and that's why it's easy to learn ZFS or invest the time to learning it, because you can reuse it in many other operating systems because it's just the same. And learning it once, using it many times is the best thing that you could do if you haven't enough ZFS knowledge yet. Okay, going next with Paulo here about SDIO firmware. Paulo writes, greetings, I have a quick question. I see this ongoing work on SDIO for ARM platforms, which is required for Wi-Fi. And I have a question on firmware. I think from what I have seen so far, there's only one Linux distro that ships the firmware with it for the Raspberry Pi. Is this something related to licensing?
I don't know that much about that bit of it. You mean the firmware for the Wi-Fi chip? That's entirely possible, but I don't know.
Yeah, I guess the one for the Raspberry Pi is free because that's the idea for the Raspberry Pi, to not make it too commercial or too, that's free and open so people can tinker and play with that. He's curious for when the RPi Wi-Fi hardware ends up being supported on FreeBSD, if it will be possible to ship the firmware with the image itself, or does it require the user to use the port below? So there's the port RPi-firmware in sysutils. As this relates to base connectivity, it would be nice to have that on the image itself without having to set up required connectivity just to get the Wi-Fi working. So after booting, the user can configure it with a keyboard and start using it. So I guess once SDIO has been tested enough and is working enough so that we can ship it, then we can think about shipping the firmwares and whether we are allowed to do it, or whether they have to provide it with the ports, like we do it for the newer graphics keyboard, for example. We don't ship that in the base system, or not the newest one. We rely on ports because that can be updated more frequently. And I guess if we come to that decision, then it's probably going to be in ports, not in the base system, because not everyone needs that in the base system. One more question.
We've shipped a lot of firmware in the base before, just because, especially for Wi-Fi, you don't have internet to go download it yet.
Yeah, chicken egg. And how do I get the Wi-Fi if I don't have Wi-Fi?
Licensing is a reason why it would end up in a port. Yeah.
That's one reason. So he has one more question. Too lazy to revisit top of email to modify it. Easy. Okay. It seems there's no link to wiki.freebsd.org from www.freebsd.org. Is there another official page from the project with documentation? Feedback I have is to make the documentation page on the main website a bit more streamlined to present all available resources. And so let's see. Let's go to freebsd.org and go to...
In particular... There was also something I was looking for the other day that was hard to find, but...
Yeah, it's there. It's on the developers. There's the wiki link.
Yeah. The wiki wasn't really meant for users. But it kind of has ended up that way, so maybe we should do something about it.
Yeah, originally all the articles on there, or the how-tos, let's say, these are supposed to become articles themselves or being integrated into the handbook. But it's just a bit of work to do that, or we don't have enough help. If you're interested in that, contact me and we can make something happen. Or we need to wait until some of the articles have stable enough or are not being worked on too much, because we don't have to make all these changes all the time. So if they're stable enough on the wiki, then we can easier transport them into the handbook or other articles. So that's the main reason. The other stuff with the streamlining, I guess documentation needs to be a little bit more front and center, or pointing to the right resources. But at least has the handbook in there, the manual pages, and we can maybe put that a little bit more central so that people can find it and don't have to go hunting for it. But good suggestion. And I guess the question with the firmware we also asked. I hope that SDIO will work one day. I mean, we're in the final stages. I've seen patches, but I think they're still under review and need a little bit more polishing.
Yeah, okay. Not really my area, so I haven't been following it very closely.
Yeah, but people are working on that. There's no big issue. It's just a matter of time for the developers to finish it. Okay, last but not least is Dan with some fun ZFS questions about labels. Okay, Dan writes, "Hey there, Alan and Benedict. Please just refer to me." Okay, yeah. This one here, well, we should have removed that. Okay. La la la. Okay. Well, it's not. I think it's anonymous enough. So he loves our show and finds it quite informing. So thanks for that. I have a couple of simple ZFS questions for you that regard how to normalize a config I inherited. Okay. So here's the one currently. So there's two. So there's a two mirror pool, mirror 0 and mirror 1. And with 2 devices each mirrored, of course. And I'm in the process of recovering the failure. So there's one degraded disk there that was previously ADA0. And now it looks like this. There's one disk resilvering. So that's the new one, I guess.
When he started, he had a degraded pool that had one disk that was missing. So it has the GUID of the disk, which is just numbers. And the second disk had the GPD ID of the device. Which is of a partition. And then the second mirror is 2 entire disks, which is actually slightly weird that you would mix whole disks and partition disks together. So yes, now that he's done the part, he's resilvering, and he's going to end up with one mirror of ADA3P3, the second mirror of just this random GPD ID, those are really annoying because if you have a bunch of disks, like the beginning and the end of the GUID, the GPD IDs are the same for every disk, and it's only a little bit in the middle that changes, and it's very hard to tell what one's what. And I'm not a big fan of GPD ID as a partition type or a label type. Yeah. So he says the top 2 disks have GPD partition tables, but ADA1 and ADA2 do not. This is driving me crazy. Ideally, I would like all 4 disks to have boot partitions and boot code, no matter what happens in the chassis. It'll work, which is the main reason why I would do it that way as well. In addition, the partitions of the first mirror are labeled with older versions of FreeBSD installer and did this weirdness where the first and second disk were consistently named. I understand that it's generally bad to use raw disks in your pools, and I'd like to be able to shrink down the pools so that they don't use the extra space. So ZFS probably has just enough slop because of the way it uses powers of 2s and so on, that you can probably detach ADA1, partition it, and then reattach it. And as long as you don't steal gigs of space for a swap partition or something, if you just create, like a 512 kilobyte boot partition and the rest for ZFS, you should be able to just reattach it to ADA2, and it will resilver, and you'll have a partition disk with boot code. And then you can do that same thing with ADA2, and there you go. As far as fixing the names of the other devices, if in your boot/loader.conf you set kern.geom.label.gpdid.enable equals 0, it will no longer do GPD ID.
Crazy labeling, yeah.
And then all your disks will just be called ADA number P number, and that will be less ridiculous.
Yeah, less wit.
Otherwise, if you're running FreeBSD 12, you can do zpool remove and actually remove mir1 and then repartition the disks and add it back if you have enough free space.
Oh, yeah, that's a feature we get.
Don't know that I recommend that just because it's meant for shrinking, not for just rebuilding that way. But it is an option.
Yeah.
The other option is, so it is in the BIOS boot case possible to boot from the unpartitioned disks. The first tiny bit of the disk isn't used, so you can write, basically if you do the MBR style boot setup to ADA1 and ADA2, basically you write a boot 1 stage that just knows to seek a megabyte into the disk past the labels, and it will reach into this special 3.5 megabyte reserved area in ZFS where you've written the boot code. So if you look at the way you can do MBR booting with ZFS, you can make that work for whole disks so that you can boot that way.
Okay.
Or maybe
there are a couple of...
maybe that won't work, actually. You might have to do it a little different to have no partition tables, because I think the boot 0 will look for an MBR and get confused.
Oh, and don't switch to the...
But anyway, easiest way is ZFS has enough slop to deal with the drive not being exactly the same number of sectors or something, where you can probably just disconnect ADA1, partition it, and reconnect it, and then do the same thing with ADA2 once the resolver is finished, and do another resolver, and then you'll have all partition disks, and you can put nice boot code on them all, and it'll be good.
Yeah, it's just a bit of disk jockeying, but yeah. Make sure that the resolvering finishes each time. There are a couple of questions at the end as well. Like, is there a ZFS command that will show the relative size of the individual disks?
zpool list-v.
Yeah, and since it's a mirror, it will always be the smallest one in all of those.
Right. But yeah, if you just do zpool list-v, it will print out for each disk its size, how much of it is used up, and so on.
And yeah, is there a way to remove and add ADA2/ADA3 as a partition without needing to resolver each one?
Not really, no.
It's the internals.
Resolver's not going to be that expensive. They're mirrors, so the resolver is relatively quick. If you're using FreeBSD 12, sequential resolver is in there, and it's much, much faster.
Yeah. And the last question we already answered with the GPTID enable equals 0.
If you just set GPTID off in the sysctl, in the boot/loader.conf, it will disable the types you don't want, which will force it to use the types you do want.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, I think that should get your pool to a more sane state, at least for labeling.
But, so yes, the labeling is less important. That's it bothers me personally as well, which is why I disable GPTID, but it's not going to hurt the functionality of the pool.
Yeah,
However,
no one will see that.
The two unpartitioned disks, if ADA0 dies and your BIOS decides to try to boot off ADA1 and it can't, then your system doesn't boot, and that's not what you want.
Yeah, and so keeping labels, because if you see, let's say a disk is dying and you have the labels exactly like the serial number, then you can say exactly, it's that one with that serial number, which should hopefully be on your label outside of the case, so you pull the right disk. But yeah, that's typically what you start off with. And if you inherited that pool, you just continue with that and maintaining that and keeping it healthy. All right. That pretty much wraps up our show this week. Thanks for watching. And again, if you have anything for us, send it to feedback@bsdnow.tv, and we'll have something to cover in the next episode.